Hey guys, it's your second or third favorite analog horror reporter checking in with y'all today. This video is, once again, out of my wheelhouse, but it's something that came to my mind while just taking a walk a few days ago. I want to discuss a meme that I saw a while back and at the time just laughed at. This may be goofy as hell, but I've recently come to appreciate it as a philosophical commentary on analog horror as a whole. This video is much more freeform than I usually am, and I've really only scripted like half of it, so I hope you enjoy this structured rambling. As always, your thoughts and comments often spur my thinking, so please let me know how you're feeling about the state of analog horror as well, down in the comments below while you're watching this video. Today, we're going to be talking about the Family Guy analog horror meme, created by BendyJW and uploaded in May of 2023. It's a meme. There's not a better way to describe it than that. Interpret it as art, interpret it as criticism if you will, do whatever, but it's a meme. However, as one might gaze into the anguished expression of the Scream or lose themselves in the eyes of the Mona Lisa, this art provided me with realizations that I wanted to share with my lovely subscribers. By the way, if you're not one of those, now is the time to change that by hitting the subscribe button to help out my channel. Anyways, to get an idea of what I'm talking about today, I'm just going to play this video in full. As always, you should check out the original video if you prefer to support the creator, and I've linked it here. But let's go right ahead. Like I said, meme. But I think an alternative way to interpret this piece is a criticism of the state of analog horror, and how some of the tropes are really getting old. Now, let me be very clear. Analog horror is not bad. It's not dumb, and it's not dead. It's not even dying. There are new projects coming out in this genre that blow me away, and I try to cover them when I come across them. But not everything is a gem in the rough, and the amount of garbage passing for analog horror is making it hard for the audience to grow and for new people to get into this type of thing. Or we can even see good series make their way into these pitfalls because they're just so easy and accepted in the analog horror space, which ends up being really detrimental to people who've shown a ton of creativity before. There's three main problems that I gleaned from this meme, and I'm gonna go ahead and just ramble about them a little bit. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about here today is ambience. Does every piece of analog horror need an arbitrarily spooky soundtrack when it doesn't make sense? No, absolutely not. This random orchestral or choir chant or whatever it is, we do see this in the space a lot, and it's unnecessary. It actually takes away from the experience for me because of something that I'll talk about in just a sec in terms of believability. But really, it's just weird. Again, it goes back to the age-old necessity in writing or art, that being show, don't tell. If you're telling me to be scared, if you're telling me, here's a spooky soundtrack, I feel like a kid being told what to do. That, of course, being told to be scared. Don't tell me to be scared. Let me get scared on my own. And it's not just the audio here. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the classic VHS decay. Now, look, there is a reason for this. This is actually part of analog horror heritage. Analog horror really all kind of spun out of a combination of alternate reality games and found footage, and VHS tapes have been a big part of this. Analog horror was born out of the idea of finding a tape, not a DVD, not a CD, not an SD card, but a tape in the woods or something, and then watching it after the fact. However, it does need an actual place in the story if you're going to use VHS decay. Arbitrary corruption makes little to no sense. There are examples, and I'm going to show some on screen, where within the narrative, the time that the videos were filmed and the time that they were watched makes corruption make sense. They were filmed in the 90s or something like that, or even before, when we did use tapes, and then the tape got corrupted because we're watching it well into the future. That makes sense. Or maybe it was in a house fire or something and it got corrupted. I don't know. But again, if there's no actual context for the VHS decay, if it's just there, if it's just a filter that you slapped on, which like literally I can do in 2 seconds with any editing program, it's lazy and it stinks, and I do think it kind of detracts from the experience. Things that pull you out of immersion don't necessarily have to be bad, but it's just when I'm thinking about immersion, when my brain starts thinking, this VHS corruption doesn't really make sense, it's taking away an opportunity for my brain to be scared because my brain is instead thinking about a little thing going wrong. It's not a big deal, and it really isn't the biggest problem in analog horror. I would say the first thing I mentioned is a little bit worse, and maybe just the spooky ambiance failing is worse in general. But it is definitely a problem. I've seen it a lot. I would like to see it go away, or I would like to see it make sense, which I'll talk about in a sec. Third thing here, and this is a smaller one, jump cuts. Like, are jump cuts overdone? Now here's the thing. Jump cuts in analog horror, again, this goes back to day one. Jump cuts are important in analog horror. When you stumble upon the haunted house with an old bag of tapes in it, they're not in order. They're not alphabetized on a shelf or put into one single 2-hour film. You're not watching a movie here. Analog horror is intrinsically intertwined with alternate reality games as well, so there's this general understanding that you have to work to unravel this story. It's not a movie that's just going to be presented to you from point A to B all the way to Z. You have to unravel it yourself, and so jump cuts are understandable, right? You're going from one tape to another, but again, you have to contextualize it. You can't just bounce around from here and there. The Family Guy meme is literally just jump cuts between different gory parts of Family Guy. And it sounds funny, this sounds ridiculous like when we're watching it here, but there are some projects that kind of do that. Now I'll use an example of a positive, right? Here, we've talked about 3 things. We've talked about jump cuts, we've talked about VHS decay, and we've talked about like soundtracks. And basically that all contributes to like faking an ambiance. But with the jump cuts and the VHS decay specifically, I mentioned the need for context. Right here, we're going to look at the McKaylee project, or whatever you want to call it. The ARG I've covered, I've made 2 videos on this now, where a guy hits a piece of metal 17 times with a hammer. If you want to learn more about that, you should watch my video on it. And right here, there's going to be some small spoilers for that series, so you've been warned. But basically, in this series, we have both VHS decay and we have jump cuts all over the place. But as we unpicked the story, we realized that there was a reason for that. What we learned was that the potential antagonist of this series, which is like an alien brainworm parasite, we don't really fully understand it yet, has taken over FBI agents. And those FBI agents are actually tampering with the evidence that the FBI has for a murder investigation. They're putting jokes in the tapes, they're decaying the tapes, they're inserting things into the tapes, and they're mucking it around. And that actually made sense. Not only did it make sense, like chronologically in the story, but it was something we had to work to, we had to theorize to get to, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, these aren't arbitrary jump cuts from different things. This is because the evidence is messed up because someone is trying to meddle with the investigation. It made sense. The decay is explained by intentional sabotage and it's woven into the story, and we had to work for it, and all of a sudden it made it great. All of a sudden I was like, wow, I'm not looking at a trope anymore. I'm watching someone turn a trope into a story element, and it was beautiful. It was awesome. So we've covered context a bit. Again, nothing is intrinsically wrong with these things, right? I mean, there are creepy music can be used during creepy sequences. I mean, just right off the bat, what's coming to mind is like the whole Riddler Ave Maria thing, or the music that always played during those sequences in Far Cry 5. I can't even think about what they're called right now. But yeah, soundtracks are intrinsically tied to horror, but you have to earn the right to use them. You can't just slap them on something you've made and said, well, this is scary now, and move on. You have to weave it in somehow. A final thing that I wanted to point out here, and this honestly just kind of made me burst out laughing, is the description of this video literally says, "Be afraid." And again, we're going back to a thing where we are told to be scared. We're not made scared. We are told, be afraid. And I think this is kind of making fun, depending on how you look at it, again, because this is a meme and I am looking way too into this because I'm sleep deprived. But there's two problems here. The first is, again, we're told to be afraid, which this does happen in analog horror all the time. Like literally an arbitrarily spooky sentence will flash up on the screen and we're just told, be scared, and we're not made scared. The second thing here is that video descriptions are often used incorrectly to be scary. So video descriptions, again, are a super important piece of analog horror. Because, for example, let's say there's an immersive story being told. We're having somebody in the story uploading videos to YouTube chronologically or like in the time of this story. And they're like asking us for help. They're like, hey, has anyone ever heard of this thing before? What does this mean? And here's an upload date and here's some other information that I had about it. And that's good because it gives you the opportunity to put in important context for the story that doesn't make sense to go in the video, right? Like if I found an abandoned tape and I just upload that tape to YouTube, for the purpose of me being a protagonist in an analog horror series, I wouldn't film myself before I played the footage saying, this video was recorded on March 12th, 1997, and I found it at these precise coordinates in the woods. Like, no, you would fill it out in the video description. So using video descriptions is not bad, but sometimes it's just arbitrary garbage. And I'm not gonna specifically criticize any projects that I've covered or anything, because this isn't malicious or anything. I don't think individual artists are making bad art. I think the community as a whole has trended towards some tropes that need to be overhauled a little bit, or at least accepted if they're contextualized properly. But there are some analog horror series that I've seen, that I've covered, where the descriptions are just arbitrarily spooky stuff, or they're just stuff that doesn't make sense. Sometimes people talk in codes, and that's fine if it makes sense, because again, if you're a protagonist uploading a video asking for help unraveling this found footage mystery, why would you encode the information, or encrypt, that's a better word, encrypt the information you're putting in the video description? It just makes no sense. So again, use your descriptions, use your video descriptions correctly. Don't just tell me to be afraid. Anyways, so that was my first major thing that I wanted to cover with this video right here. Again, this is not a super huge criticism. It's just, I think ambiance in analog horror is trending in that general direction of lacking contextualization, and again, just telling, not showing. My final words on this are, if you want to use these tropes, that's fine. I guarantee if I ever made an analog horror series, there would be some VHS tape decay in it at some point, but I wouldn't just slap it on there. If you want to use these tropes, contextualize them. Do a great job sewing it into the story like it was done in the McKaylee series. We're going to move on to the next major thing here. Number 2 is just general gore and violence. Now, gore isn't really the right word for analog horror, for what we see in analog horror, because analog horror thrives on YouTube. That is its native biome. So it's toned down enough, or it's cartoonish enough that usually it's not going to disturb you. I have yet to be so disturbed by gore or violence in an analog horror series that I didn't enjoy it. But it's getting to the point where it's always in series, and it just it sucks. Showing quote unquote victims is a trope of analog horror now. Here's the dead body, and it's it literally, I'm just going to describe you something. I want you to imagine a black background and white text and a white picture of a creepy face that looks like it has a 5 million lumen flashlight shining directly at it, and the only thing you could see is that it's creepy or disfigured or something. And then the white text is a name, comma, age. And it's just you're looking at a victim. I'm going to play as many of these as I can, because there really are so many. Here's the victim. And it's it's not that it's gross. It's just it's not fear. It's not tense. Here's my problem with showing just your victims in analog horror, right? It demonstrates that the fear is gone because the person is already dead. There are a ton of great series on YouTube where there are chase sequences, where there are footsteps behind you that you just kind of catch in the left side of your headphones and you're like, whoa, what was that? But when you have this presentation, all it's making me recognize is that something bad happened, but I don't feel any dread or anticipation. I lied, I am going to do a little criticism of an individual series. I recently covered I think their original name is Siltrix, but they've since changed it. They've been working on an amazing, full DC universe analog horror series, and it was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I covered it in its infancy. It's since grown a ton. Highly recommend you check it out. But I remember specifically just one upload where it was talking about, and again, this is minor spoiler alert, but there was a little upload talking about the Batman having gone through Arkham Asylum and killed 4 patients. And it didn't show their bodies, but it just described them, and it was just okay, they're dead. Cool. I don't know. It's not really making me feel anything. Or again, going back to the last thing, anything in moderation. You do it once, that's totally fine. But I do feel like I'm seeing at least one instance of just oh, here's a dead body, here's a victim, in every single series that I watched at least one time. And in the Family Guy meme right here, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing dead bodies, but we're seeing jump cuts from the quote unquote violent parts of Family Guy. And I really think that's the creator of the meme just working with the best they've got, right? I do kind of think if we interpret this video as a criticism, they're criticizing the fact that a lot of analog horror is just jump cuts between oh, this guy was killed, this was whatever. And maybe this is revealing that I just have preferences. I've really preferred, one of my favorite things to see in analog horror is this first-person filmed found footage stuff where there's tense chase sequences. The Oldest View, that was super tense. That was awesome. I loved watching that. I didn't cover it because bigger people covered it. There wasn't anything unique I had to say at the moment. It wasn't worth... I would not have provided unique enough entertainment to you guys, so I never covered it, but I really enjoyed it. But there's a ton of this I like, and it provides... I like the tense fear. A lot of people think analog horror is only glimpsing into the past, but it's not. It can be tense. Local 58 is a great example of this. My favorite piece of analog horror ever, as I've said, I did a whole video on this, is the contingency video from Local 58. And that's very present if you follow the theory that I provided. It is having consequences in the present day, but at the end of the day, we're watching a video filmed in 1960 something. It's an old video. We're watching an old video. All of the fear is gone. But in that same series, in the same Local 58 series, we have the episode, You're on the Fastest Available Route, which is maybe one of the most tense pieces of analog horror. I love this video. This, again, minor spoilers for this, even though it's pretty old. But you have a guy just driving on the road. You have to go back and watch it to realize that, his device is maybe being tampered with. But you watch it and you're well, why is this guy going on back roads all of a sudden? He's in some sedan. He could get stuck. He's driving through the woods. It's creepy. It's the woods at night. And there are things happening, and then the car stops and you don't really know why, and then there's the climax, and it's really tense. So I want you to keep that idea in your mind for a second. There's another way you could have covered that story. You could have started the video with no voice narration, just an arbitrary text narration telling you what happened with no context, right? Not understanding who made this tape, why is it presented this way, and it's just narrating on 11:59 p.m. Sunday night, authorities found this car crashed in the woods. And then, the next panel says, his face was ripped to shreds by suspiciously alien-shaped claws. And then it's here is a photo of the victim. And then you just see his dead body, and you see his car. And it's where's the tension? The tension is gone. It was beaten to death before it even had the chance to be born. There's no tension. And I have seen a lot of series, I have seen a lot of pieces of analog horror that chose to present that hypothetical idea in that way. Instead of bringing us into the tension, instead of making us see... The whole point of found footage is you come across the aftermath and you're what happened? And then you watch the found footage and it gives you the answer. The found footage, the VHS tape, isn't supposed to be narration. It's not supposed to be an after the fact. Why would you watch a VHS tape of a police report? That makes no sense. The police report would be something that, if you even needed it, it would be in the video's description, or there would be, you would, like some projects we have that jump between like, here's a video of me and my buddy in the present day talking about this. And then the next upload is the actual thing we're talking about, the actual VHS tape, the actual upload episode, whatever. I think this goes back to an issue of framing. And I've totally like rambled away from gore and violence here. That was like the original point I was supposed to be talking about. But I springboarded. Basically, that was all I had to say about gore and violence. But we get back to framing. And creators, they're making amazing art, but they're getting confused with what they're trying to show, and they're framing it incorrectly. Some characteristics of analog horror are, it's a tape, it's lost, there are mysterious circumstances, there are unanswered questions, right? It's a piece of footage you come across. It should not be a police report with details. Videos like this, for example, where they're trying to make the police report the creepy part, that doesn't make sense. The police report is written after all the tension is gone. The police report is safe. It's not scary. You read it for context and then you see the tension. People are like combining both of these things and they're showing like, oh, here's the victim. Okay, why would a photo of the victim or a police report or a news report, newsreel, like whatever, why would that be decayed? That's supposed to be presented clearly. The fear, the footage, the creepy decayed part is supposed to be the actual found footage part. So again, it's just like, it's an issue of framing, I would say, and I hope I'm making sense with my criticism here. Because this is coming from a place of, I'm not trying to tear this down, I am trying to provide something constructive. But I do think analog horror creators need to go out and they need to say, I'm filming something that happened in the present, and the fear has been removed, and this exists just for context and story and not for arbitrary spookiness, or I'm going to show something terrifying. And I do think with analog horror, you do have to bounce back and forth between tension and fear and context. You do have to drive the story forward, and you aren't going to be able to let the audience guess everything for themselves. You have to provide some context, but you can provide context without giving the arbitrary spookiness that isn't necessary, and the arbitrary jump cuts that aren't necessary, and background music that makes no sense. Anyway, I totally diverted from the original point, so apologies for that, but I hope I made sense with that. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the third major criticism that I think this video brings up. And this is really funny because I took the time to criticize some other people, so I'm going to criticize myself here a bunch. When I watched this video for the first couple of times, I could not figure out for the life of me, what did Chris mean? Like, what is this dumbass Chris Griffin insert supposed to mean? Then I kind of had this like aha moment, and I'm like, you could look at this Family Guy analog horror video as someone like me who plays like 30 seconds of analog horror and then goes, this is so creepy, and like recants it and explains what happened and then plays the next bit. And it just made me think of the people, like myself, who cover analog horror treat it. It's hilarious. I do like making fun of myself. And I do think I tend to do a good job because this does come from a place of passion, right? Like this is something I like to cover. I have not shown a series to you guys that I did not like, but it is kind of funny, this format. Scary garbage, YouTuber reaction, scary garbage, YouTuber reaction. Like, that sounds pretty familiar all of a sudden. And depending on whether or not you like my coverage, you could fit me into that. I would say there are some YouTubers that I've watched their analog horror coverage and I love it every time. There's some analog horror YouTubers where I've watched it and I like it 80% or 50% of the time. The other percent of the time I'm like, why are you still elaborating on this? Like, why are you telling me this is scary? You're telling me it sent chills down your spine, and I'm looking at like the least scary thing I've seen in my life. And there are some YouTubers out there, some people who are like recapping analog horror that they're not doing a good job. And I'm not criticizing people who have really good ideas and maybe they're just starting, they're new YouTubers, or they're learning editing, or they're learning writing and improving. I'm not talking about those people. Those people are amazing and I want to give them a chance because people gave me a chance when I had 0 subscribers and my ideas were not perfectly fleshed out. But there are people who definitely know better and are just trying to capitalize on analog horror as a keyword. And again, I am not calling myself innocent here. There are definitely some valid criticisms of Seed Butter that I've internalized, that I've heard with regards to like how I cover analog horror. And that's fine. Please continue to give me those things. I want to hear it. But I am going to turn around and give those same criticisms to YouTubers. Again, it's a little annoying when I'm trying to watch. There's a good reason to watch analog horror like recaps and theories, because I want to listen to, sometimes I want to relax and I want to take in analog horror, but I'm tired and I don't want to sit and theorize and decode. I want to listen to someone explain to me what the community did to solve this in terms of maybe actual alternate reality game elements or just theories and stuff. So there is a really good reason to watch people who like me who make videos like that. But there are a lot of people who just drive that into the ground. Like, they aren't providing good theories, they aren't providing commentary, they're just reacting. They're like, whoa, this is scary. You have to provide something original. And I have not been the best at this. There's a reason there are a ton of YouTubers who cover analog horror who have a lot more subscribers than me. But I do think generally I'm trying to bring something to the table. I'm trying to theorize. I try to add, right? And there are a lot of YouTubers who don't add. And to some degree, it should be, when you look up analog horror, you should see analog horror. You should watch analog horror. If you look up analog horror, the first 50 things you're going to find are people reacting to or explaining analog horror, not actual analog horror. And there's a reason for that. It's because if you make good analog horror, you don't say analog horror in the title. That actually kills the entire thing. The only reason you would do that is if you want YouTube to push your videos to the right audience. So like, since the beginning of artists have to walk a balance between doing what gets them recognized and paid and doing what makes art that they want to make. So there's nothing wrong with identifying that your craft is analog horror. But most projects don't, right? Most projects, the names are just like a file name, an episode name, or like an in-story contextualized name. So you're not really going to find it if you just Google analog horror. But if you do Google analog horror, you're going to see a lot of commentary. And there's nothing wrong with commentary. I love commentary. I watched it before I was a YouTuber. I watch it now. I will watch it 2 years from now. It is a valid criticism of this space as a whole that there are a lot of YouTubers not adding anything. Right? I do think there is a trifecta of analog horror creators, analog horror audience, and analog horror commentators. We kind of act, we as in people like me, Seed Butter, right? We act as a middleman between the audience and the creator, because a lot of people do come to YouTube and they're tired and they just want to be entertained and they don't want to have to work through a project. They don't want to have to theorize. They don't want to have to think. They want to be filled in. And that's where people like me come in. And there's nothing wrong with that. Generally, I do what I can to drive traffic to the original artist. So I want, because I want to help both the audience and the artist, right? Every artist I've ever, whose projects I've ever covered, like a lot of times we've talked together afterwards, and I've had good, like I have pretty good relationships with a lot of the people whose projects I've covered. And it doesn't matter who they are, but like no one's came to me and just said like, I hate your interpretation. I've only gotten constructive criticism or just like a thank you. And that means a lot to me because I would not exist without them. They would totally exist without me. So anyways, there is a market niche for these reaction YouTubers or these analog horror commentators, whatever you want to call it. There's a market niche for that. But add something, please. Yeah, that's it. And again, this is, I am looking way into a meme. Like this, I don't think Bendy JW really thought this out when they made it. I think they just made a funny meme, and that's how 2.7 million people have interpreted this thing, as a funny meme. So yeah, it's just something I came up with. Now there is a little, point 3.5 here, a little bonus point is there's a whole other interpretation of Chris, which I actually stole from somebody in the comments, where they suggested that this is Chris waking up to all of the crazy stuff that happens in Family Guy. So like if you look at these clips, right, Family Guy is a very, it's goofy, it's slapstick humor. But we're watching people like we're watching like characters like stab each other to death, right? Like this is pretty violent and horrible. And Family Guy is one of those shows where like the way the time works is just like that next episode you wake up and everything's back to normal. And that's because it's a freaking TV show. It doesn't matter. But someone suggested that maybe Chris is like waking up to this happening in his life and like his mind's been wiped 50 times or something. And he's like part of a crazy experiment or something. And I think this is also a critique of analog horror. I seriously, right now, I am the champion of making something out of nothing here. But if you wanted to interpret Chris like this, if you wanted to say Chris is part of the story here in this faux analog horror, this meme, right? Here's the criticism I interpret from that. I have seen some projects create grandiose stories of something crazy going on, like mind wiping or psychological manipulation or like science experiments, and like they're just way overthinking it. Like sometimes it's scary to just be stalked in the woods. It's scary. A normal murderer who is a total human, who is not invincible, who just, puts you in a found footage situation, that's still scary. That's tense. That's terrifying. You don't necessarily need a full-blown conspiracy to be frightened over. And that's, the idea here is, that Chris is part of this conspiracy, that he's like waking up to the true nature of Family Guy. Generally, that is not the worst thing in the world, but I think I would say, I'm going to try to like reduce this to like such a simple, like explain why analog horror and just this general idea of found footage is good in one sentence. Found footage took away the financial and technical barrier of creating a creative film. And in taking away that barrier, it allowed a lot of people's creativity to flow, which would not otherwise have flowed. And it's just the same thing with like, how Blair Witch is remembered as fondly as it is. Anything that allows people to circumvent technical difficulties and replace it with a really creative idea, that's good. And that's what the original shtick with found footage was. It was just, here's a scary thing, here's a killer in the woods, here's XYZ, it's scary, but it's normal, it's human, it's not something you need to overthink. And here it is. You don't need to overthink it. One piece of advice I have to budding analog horror creators is don't think of like a 50-page MKUltra conspiracy theory when you're just trying to scare me. Like, just scare me. Focus on the creativity. Focus on scaring me. Focus on like a cool set. And if you want to expand on that later, great. You can always, like, one of the things with horror is you can always make it bigger if you want. You can always say, like, you can always write a closed-ended story about a creepy character, and then you could, in the next episode, you could say, well, he was actually a member of a secret science experiment in Siberia gone wrong, and in episode 2, we're going to go back to that bunker in Siberia and unravel the whole mystery. Like, you can always come back to it. Don't worry about, like, constructing a grandiose thing right off the bat. It does not need to be that serious. Focus on the presentation, focus on the horror, and the lore will flow. Lore is only good when the story is too. That's the last thing I have to say. Anyways, yeah, those are just my thoughts. Like, this, again, take this with a grain of salt. Actually, what I'd rather you do is tell me what you think instead. Tell me where you think I'm wrong. I would love some like discourse in the comments. And yeah, this is not a hit piece on analog horror. I kind of just felt like rambling about my thoughts about this situation. And one thing I will say is I actually enjoyed this. I'm recording it, but like now that I'm like talking about it, I'm enjoying this a lot more than I thought I would. And I'm totally open to the idea of like an actual more structured 40-minute video with like an actual thesis on analog horror as a whole, and like how it's developed, strengths, weaknesses, or like the state of it, whatever you want. So if you guys are interested in that, if you guys actually if we get some good discourse going and you actually did like what I had to say today, let me know, and I would totally like to come back to it. So yeah, just concluding, I appreciate you guys. Let me know how you feel about this like much more freeform thing. This is not the future of Seed Butter. This is just, I'm recording out of a tiny room right now with a tiny lav mic, just doing the best I can. I've been traveling a lot, but I'm still trying to think of you guys and get you guys as many uploads as I can. There are new ideas coming. There are plenty of reasons for you to sub and share the channel with your friends and join our Discord, because we have new stuff coming. It's very exciting. I'm very excited. But yeah, this is just what I wanted to talk about today. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll catch you later. Peace.